Hi, Andy, and hi, everybody who's joining us today. Thank you very much for coming to a webinar, Sustainable X webinar on carbon credits and carbon offsetting and how to build them into your sustainability strategies. So I'm Rhonda Allen, I'm from Sustainable X, and I'm here with Andy Harris from Nature Broking, who is one of our sustainable experts. So, Andy, I'm just going to just ask you to introduce yourself briefly, and I've got some questions, but before I start, this is being recorded and we will forward this out after the event. If anybody has any questions, please use the Q&A question box. Hopefully we'll get them, catch them up at the end, or if we haven't answered them already. So Andy, tell me a bit about yourself and what you do at Nature Broking.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for organising this and having me on, Rondi. I'm Andy. I'm the managing director of Nature Broking. Nature Broking is a premium carbon credit and natural capital intermediary and advisory firm. So we work with large organisations, big companies, big public sector organisations to essentially meet their climate targets in a way they can be proud of. And what that in reality means is that we work with the highest possible premium carbon credit projects all around the world, with a specialism actually in the UK. And we enable companies to invest in those through carbon credits, and that will help them reach things like their net zero targets, if they have, let's say, SBTI targets, or other goals such as investment in nature, investment in local communities, carbon neutral targets, and so on. I would say, as a thing that I tend to always say, we are very much a high-end advisory service. We help build the strategy. We tend to work on kind of long-term partnerships with our clients. We're not the cheapest, but we like to think that we are the best. So I'll throw that caveat in early.
So, I mean, there's a lot of big words there, and this is a really complicated space, for sure. And I don't know a lot about it. So, just starting from the basics, Andy, if a business was thinking about carbon credits and carbon offsetting, where would they even start? Like, back to basics, what should they be looking for, and what do they need to know first before they even move on it?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'll take it even probably back to even more basics and things that everybody, I'm sure, in this call, and I know that Sustainable Experts Group and Sustainable X generally is very au fait with and understands, is kind of the principles around why you would use
Yeah,
carbon offsets. So I actually do have a slide on this. Let me see if I can get this
yeah,
working. Not this one. So can I flick it from here? No. Let's try. Aha, there we go. Can you see that graph?
yeah, we can, yeah.
Um, Perfect. So, sorry to hit everyone with a graph immediately, but this hopefully illustrates a little bit why you would start to frame your thinking around engaging with carbon credits. And this is increasingly why businesses are increasingly doing it. And really, there are two reasons. Um, every business here probably has some level of decarbonisation plan, always thinking about having one. And that's that red curved line going down top left to bottom right. So you're decarbonising your business as you should be. And that is a fundamental and priority thing that businesses should be doing. Now, where carbon credits come in, investing in carbon projects is to offset the impact of the emissions that are still going into the atmosphere, or the emissions that you can't get rid of once you've reduced down as much as possible. So to that first point, on the way down to reducing your emissions to as low as you possibly can, you should really be considering what can you do to mitigate and offset the impact of the emissions that are going into the atmosphere. And that's where initially carbon credits come in.
Mm.
So that's what we tend to call beyond value chain mitigation. In other terms, it's used to be called, or less popular now as a term, but carbon neutral. But
Mm.
essentially these white arrows. Now,
Yeah.
if you are slightly ahead and you've got a really good, robust plan for decarbonisation, you might have a net zero plan. And that is where you
Mm.
have got a robust date in which you will have reduced your emissions down as much as possible. And that's represented by what's on the right here. So that green line, you might,
Mm.
that date might be 2030 in the sort of nearer term, 2035, 2040. Now, no business that I know of will be able to reduce down to zero. It's simply impossible in our current economic system. We still
Mm.
rely on fossil fuels, we still have unabatable emissions. So, a critical component to net zero is to use carbon credits, and particularly what are called carbon removal credits, to offset those residual emissions in the end, typically around 10% of your sort of baseline emissions you've got. So the Science Based Target Initiative, if people are aware of that, it's a sort of framework for setting net zero targets. So they endorse this. They endorse the use of carbon removals for your residual emissions. The UK government has just come out with its endorsement for that, and lots of other kind of supranational bodies are doing the same. So it's a really critical part of the full scope and journey of how you're looking to decarbonize and mitigate. Sorry for the graph early on.
No, it's good to get some of the terminology sort of in sort of as a baseline. But for a business, they've got a plan, they know it's a thing, their competitors are doing it, so where would they even start to look? And because it's there's a lot in carbon credits, isn't there? And there's a lot of offsetting, and you see people planting trees, and for every new customer they plant a tree. So how would they know where to go first? Like, it's really back to those basics. They've got a carbon reduction plan and they know they need offsetting in their strategy. What's the next step?
Absolutely, and my word is a complex, filled industry, which is why we have a very high level jargon buster here. But to take a step back even from this as well, so to start with, the voluntary carbon market is what we're talking about here today. So this is carbon credits that you would buy that actually represent something underneath, an activity underneath that's being done to mitigate carbon. Now, it was 5 years ago a little bit more of a sort of corporate social responsibility agenda, a little bit looser, but over the last 5 years, there has been a huge and rapid professionalization and actually financialization of this market. And it really now resembles what you would see from serious regulated financial markets. And it is going that way in terms of regulation. So it's actually quite professionalized. And there's a lot of markers you can look for that are analogous to financial markets that tell you where you should be operating. And you should also be thinking about it from your own due diligence and perspective in that way. So having a sensible advisor, someone who really understands what they're talking about, is really important. But also looking at the number one thing would be different carbon crediting standards. And there are tons out there, literally hundreds around the world. But some of the really big named ones are kind of maybe people are more aware of, like Verra, Gold Standard, Puro. There's a bunch that are really well regarded. And also frameworks out there. If people have heard of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market and ICROA, these frameworks sort of give endorsements to different standards. Now, I wouldn't expect people necessarily to know all the different ones and everything acronym I've given there, but just to give people an awareness that there's actually a lot of rigor and frameworks and internationally endorsed and recognized framework standards, guidelines, and everything out there that actually creates a pretty rigorous market. But
so to interrupt on those standards, if I'm looking to do offsetting and I find a company, they should have one of those standards that should be present on their website, or I should see that they're accredited to some standard.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right? Exactly. And some standards are better than others. Some are much more appropriate to different types and technologies. Some are better for different geographies. And having that level of advice is where it comes, or understanding is very important to know what's appropriate for you and your journey. And I suppose to crystallize that, this jargon buster slightly helps because, I won't touch on what emissions are. I think we all know that. Natural capital, I mean, probably all know that, but realistically, it's just anything from nature that we rely on to make our economy spin. Carbon credits, very quickly, are a carbon credit and a carbon offset exactly the same thing. It always equals 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So where you basically treat everything as if it's carbon dioxide in terms of its atmospheric potency, but it can also be talking about methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor, and other greenhouse gases. But we always talk about it in terms of carbon dioxide. And this bottom left one is the critical one. So there are 3 types of carbon credit. There's a removal credit, which actually sucks carbon out of the atmosphere through an activity. Let's say planting trees turns carbon into the roots, the trunk, the leaves. There's a reduction credit, which is where you reduce down from an activity which before did push more carbon into the atmosphere. Now you've paid money to reduce that. So let's say converting tractors on a farm to electric or hydrogen. And then there are avoidance credits, and these are avoiding carbon that might have otherwise gone into the atmosphere by an intervention. So this is protecting an area of rainforest, let's say, which may well have released carbon if it wasn't protected. Now, in ordering of sort of what you would consider robustness premium credits, it goes left to right. So removals are the best. They're the ones that are the most endorsed, the things that you should be using where possible, all the way down to avoidance, which are still important activities, but whether you should be using them as carbon credits is sort of a question. Now, with nature broking, for example, we only really work in the removal space. We do some
Right.
reductions that are really important. We don't really do avoidance. So your carbon standards will be relevant to these. So you'll have
Yeah.
different scientific methodologies that sit under different standards that do different, one of these three different things. And then you need to know how to apply those to whatever target you've got, whether it's net zero or carbon neutral, because different ones apply in different ways.
Right. And okay, so moving on to so let's walk it through. I've got a carbon reduction plan. I've got a net zero plan. I want to, because it's voluntary at the moment, offset to support my reduction plan. I go to nature broking as an advisor. What happens next? How do I buy trees from you? What do I buy? Is there something else I can buy? And how can I make business value out of that? Is there anything else I can do with that? Because we're all about really maximizing the value. Like employees love it, customers love it. Tell me more about the value that adds and how the process
Yeah,
works.
sure. And actually, I'll flip that on its head because that's typically the narrative way round you probably want to think about it, which is, so what are your targets as a business and what are your values and what are the business drivers you want to get out of it? That will define the type of activity you want to invest in from a project perspective. Now, there are hundreds of different
Can you give me an
methodologies.
example?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the one that everyone knows is trees, right?
Yeah.
So you can plant trees to suck carbon atmosphere, but let's say blue carbon, right? Anything to do with the marine environment, you can grow specific types of kelp and then sink that to the bottom of the ocean, which locks the carbon that it's absorbed into the ocean floor and actually helps with ocean deacidification and all sorts of other co-benefits. There's regenerative agriculture. There's concrete carbon, when you inject carbon into the concrete making process and actually store that carbon away in concrete for as long as the concrete lasts or longer. So, and there's all sorts of funky other ones, biochar, enhanced rock weathering. I mean, there are hundreds of types that are really, really good. And you need to be able to pick through them. One of the
Yeah.
ways to do that, as I say, is go, well, what do we want? So employee satisfaction is well known, well trodden understanding of a well understood benefit of investing in any kind of nature based project, social benefit, community project, and particularly carbon projects. There was a report recently done by Microsoft, I believe, that said that 66% of employees would consider moving business if they didn't have good sustainability credentials. The same with customers, and that's really important. So we work with, for example, a lot of NHS suppliers who have it written into their contracts that they actually have to do a certain amount of carbon projects with
Yeah.
carbon credits to actually win contracts. And that's the same with consumer brands. It's the same with, big suppliers, B2B brands. You have to now basically show you're doing good stuff. And there's a whole bunch of other aspects that make business sense to a business, for example. And we touched on this yesterday. Won't go into depth if anybody wants to, and everyone's an accountant here. You can now capitalize carbon credits on your balance sheet as an asset. So against the liabilities that you have for meeting your net zero targets, for example. So that's actually a big kind of important one for
Big
the
benefit.
valuation. Huge benefit. And that's not to touch on any of the fact that your values might be that you work in a space, for example, you might be a food manufacturer and you want to help regenerative agriculture because it's good for the industry. You might be an insurance company with a big portfolio of buildings you insure on coastal regions, therefore coastal flood defense carbon credits that, mangrove forests, for example, are really important. So that will define what you want to do. If you look at yourself and you go, what do we want to do for our employees, our customers? How do we want to treat these carbon credits and incorporate it into our business from a business perspective? What would sing to the board if we spoke to them? And then what are our values? That helps you define what you want to go for. And then someone like us can go, well, here you go. Here's your list of fantastic projects to your budget that would make perfect sense. And here's the mechanisms by which you should engage with it.
And so do clients come to you with concepts and ideas, or do you go to them and say, look, this is the range of 100 things you could do, which one aligns to your value set or your strategy? Or because you don't know what you don't know in this carbon credit world. You don't know that you can inject it into carbon, like into concrete. So is that what someone would come to you with?
Yeah, typically it's iterative. We often have clients who are very well informed, very large clients. They come and they say, look, we know everything. And they do, they really are knowledgeable. But it's still iterative. And then when you've got clients who are slightly less au fait with the market, it's still an iterative process where there's a jumping off point. That might simply be I have a budget and a target, but it might be
Right.
I have a really cool list of projects I want to get involved in. I actually just really need some due diligence on it, and also looking at purchasing any extras that you might think of. But our job is to then any good advisory and service, I suppose, in this space would basically do a couple of things. They would help build the strategy around that iterative process. Taking whatever you've told us, we will help build something co-aligned to development process, and then due diligence is super important. So we would go in and go in depth. This is the risks. These are the co-benefits, the impact you would expect, and critically, here are the trade-offs, because every carbon credit project has a trade-off. None are perfect. So you've got to understand what it is you're losing for the gain.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it's an amazing space. Something we hear a lot. We know we want carbon credits and net zero plans are business important. The clients are asking for it, B2B suppliers especially. But it is the Wild West. So how do you kick the tires on this, and how do you make sure that you're not investing in a forest in trees in California that are going to burn down? Like, that due diligence piece. How do you get that security around what should you be looking out for when you start moving down this path?
Sure. And actually, to that Wild West point, it's a well used phrase. And actually, I would contend now that we've moved beyond the Wild West phase of the market. I think when we started in this space, it was. And so many organizations have moved, and not just organizations, UK government regulations, semi-governmental organizations and so on have moved to actually contain that and change that. So actually it's really moving away from that sort of style of market. It's actually very professionalized now. But what is still critical, because of the eclectic nature of what's out there, is to do due diligence and understand it. So what we tend to say is there are essentially 3 lines of defense in terms of risk within carbon credits. I did promise a slide on this, but I didn't get around to it, I'm afraid. So I will try my best to walk through it. So my background is in banking and finance risk and compliance, and then I moved into ESG risk. So I come at it very much from a sort of how do you build those layers of defense. And your base layer is picking is essentially picking the right standards. As I said, really important to pick really good, robust, embedded standards that have very good inbuilt risk mechanisms. For example, buffers, where they hold back a certain number of credits from any project to then reissue from that global pool if there are failures, if there's wildfire, if there's fraud, or whatever it might be. So that's kind of your first layer, the inbuilt mechanisms. The second layer is where due diligence in a company like us comes in, which is you need to have someone who basically tells you all those trade-offs, who looks at it and goes, this is the internal risk set up in the project. They've set it up in such a way that we don't think it's going to mitigate, risks of fraud or, I don't know, fair compensation to the underlying landholders. The external risks, which are, like, it's a woodland project in California, there's a high risk of it burning down. It's a project in Zimbabwe. Well, the Zimbabwe government appropriated all of their credits last year, a couple of years ago. So you need to understand these geopolitical risks as well. And that's your second layer. And there's a bunch of sort of companies that will do high level ratings, like ratings agencies. And then, we will go into that level, extra sort of bespoke level of depth. And then the final layer of risk mitigation, which is really important, is essentially comes down to how you structure your solution. Diversified portfolios are the best thing. So this is what most clients are doing now, right? So you go, rather than one project, we're buying a bunch of 10,000 tons of carbon, let's say, pluck a number out of thin air. You want to diversify across 10 projects, and that will reduce your exposure to wholesale loss within the portfolio. And actually, what excitingly, that makes it insurable. So we have insurance partners, for example, which put an insurance wrapper around it for loss in any case. And then on top of that, when you get really thinking, you can start buying forward, buying for delivery of the credits actually ahead of your net zero year, so you don't need them now, so they're not actually on your books and they come in 2030 and so on. So that's the sort of structuring layer. But once you do those 3 things, you have a very, very low risk project, set a portfolio and solution, essentially.
Wow. It is a whole new industry, isn't it? It's like it is an amazing sector. I'm really especially interested in the interesting projects that businesses are linking to their strategy. Do you see any other massive value? I know you mentioned that you can capitalize on your balance sheet, and I guess that's coming, but I'm thinking a little earlier stage businesses that are still learning about credits. Any nice touch, any bonuses that they're getting, and anything that it's giving them some really nice business sort of halo impacts,
Well,
other
yeah,
than the net zero plan?
absolutely. And look, so all carbon credits will have some level of co-benefit.
Yeah.
And so you're not just sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, you're engaged in regenerative agriculture, which greens our food supply and is great for biodiversity. You're doing enhanced rock weathering, where you're spreading fine silicate rock on that you've crushed from a mine onto land
Yeah.
as a fertilizer, and it's fantastic again for ocean deacidification, as that runs off into the water and is an alkaline, and it does all sorts of fantastic things for the marine environment, but it's also a replacement for artificial fertilizers. And I could go on and on and on. We do not have the time for
Yeah.
it, but the story behind all of that is fantastic for your business, for what it aligns to your values, and critically your employees. So one of the main things
Mm.
we do is we actually take clients to the site of their projects where we can. So particularly in the UK, with UK clients, will take you down and we'll go down to sites of farms, regen ag, woodland, and so on. Show the impact firsthand. We'll run training there around
Yeah.
carbon, and that kind of employee engagement is critical to engendering a sense of accountability and ownership over your sustainability as a business as a whole. And that then translates up through the chain of the business into your shareholders, into the board, and into the kind of the overall ethos of the business. And we see that happening where we can help with that sort of journey. And so actually engaging directly is the first number one benefit you see out of all of this that trickles throughout the organization.
The cost of carbon credits, what does it cost? Well, I know
Well,
how long is a piece of string, but
yes.
what's the cost today? What, what do people have to think about, talk about, and is it increasing?
It is increasing. Well, it's increasing for goods credits. It is slightly how long is a piece of string. So for those three categories of credits, we talked about removals, reduction, avoidance. Removals most expensive, avoidance the lowest. Avoidance internationally, you can get those as low as $2 or $3 a credit. Now, I really would not recommend doing that. They're that cheap for a reason. They're outdated, they're old, they're trying to be getting rid of books, they're not particularly useful for actually your targets, they're not aligning to any standards anymore. Try to avoid it. They sort of go up to, for reduction credits, you start to get into the low teens, I suppose, for good quality reduction credits. They can get quite high. They can go into sort of, $30-$40 a ton, maybe, depending on the location. And removals start in the sort of low teen area, mid-teen area, but really you're looking more in the sort of $30-$40-$50 a ton plus. And then it slightly depends on location and type of credit. So nature-based solutions are actually very good value. So planting trees, they're undervalued at the moment. So you can get quite good value. Tech-based solutions, overvalued. They will come down in price, really expensive, as much as $2,000 a ton if you want to go for the right one. Well, not the right one, but particular ones. They can be hundreds of dollars. So slightly depends. Location makes a big difference because of the risk of the country, the robustness of the kind of regulatory frameworks. UK is quite expensive because it's such a robust place to do projects. Global South tend to be a bit cheaper for the exact inverse reason, and the fact that land is cheaper, labor's cheaper, and so on. So there is a real spread, but removals is your premium, and you're looking at sort of lowest $30 a ton internationally. UK average maybe $50-$60, all the way into the hundreds.
And the geography of where you buy your removal credit depends on your strategy and where you're aligned, right? Would that be the right thing to say, or budget?
Absolutely. So we tend to find that, geography is driven by two things. It's driven by alignment to typically our client locations. They say, look, we're in a proposal working with a client at the moment who's got 96 offices, right? And they say we want to align to our locations. You pick strategic ones, and they want their employees to be able to engage. Makes perfect sense. Then the constraining factor or the accelerating factor on that tends to be budget. So they'll say, oh, actually our budget is this high, and you go, you're going to miss out on some UK credits, or actually it's this high, so actually you can do loads of UK credits because it's a bit more premium. So location is driven by price and where you typically are based, and that's a really good method of doing it.
So I know we've just in the last 5 minutes, and if anyone had any questions, pop them in the chat. Was there anything I didn't ask you about, Andy, that it would be interesting to know for this recording or this webinar?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is. Unfortunately,
there's lots of interesting things.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
anything that I didn't ask that you thought I might, or that people ask all the time,
Yeah,
or a
I
common
think I
myth.
think I think all common myths is good. I think the common myth generally is that it's a risky place to operate, and actually it's kind of not, as long as you're working with or have in house the right expertise to kind of help navigate it. I think the thing that I would encourage everybody to start thinking about now is, if you have a net zero journey, and I think this is particularly important, net zero journeys, you're going to find yourself very quickly on the sharp end of rising prices and carbon credits, and a lack of supply and high quality removals, which is what is required for you to be able to meet your net zero plan. So if you have a 2030 target, we work day in day out with businesses who are actually putting in long-term forward agreements to actually lock in those credits and purchase them now.
Oh,
They're
wow.
locking in the price low. They're securing the supply of the credits they want, because they know they're not going to be around, because there's going to be a big undersupply around 2030 to 2040. So I would encourage everybody to start thinking ahead, start thinking about how they build these diversified portfolios, because you are essentially saying, I have a net zero target, and if you're not going to think ahead and deal with the carbon credits, you're kind of saying, I'm not taking my net zero target seriously, and I'm going to probably drop it, because that is a fundamental part of it. So I would encourage you, if you're really serious about it, start thinking about your credit aspect.
Yeah. I suppose if you can capitalize that expenditure,
Yeah,
and it
absolutely.
appreciates, you've got an asset on your books, and it's a win-win. But
Yeah,
great point. One question: are there any greenwashing risks? Can you confidently talk about what you've bought?
Yeah, absolutely, you can. So greenwashing is really in the eye of the beholder. Well, not the eye of the beholder, but in the eye of, I don't know how to say this, what the phrase is, but the eye of the person who makes the claim. So
Yes.
the critical thing here with carbon credits is transparency and understanding of what you have and why you have it. Every carbon credit, no matter what it is, unless there's some fraud in it, but it's very rare, and it's the same as fraud in any business, basically is good. It's a good thing to be doing. If you understand what you've got, you can make the appropriate claim.
Explain it.
You can understand if it should be against the net zero target or not, because it's the right type or the wrong type. You can understand everything about it. So that's where you need that transparency, that due diligence, and that kind of touch point close to the credit.
Okay. Yes. So it's evidence. It's backup. It's history. It's being transparent. Yeah. Fantastic. I think we're close to time, and there no other questions. If anybody wanted to get in touch with Andy, he's at Nature Broking. Get in touch with us, and we're very happy to send it over. Contact us at rondi@sustainablex.co.uk. What's your email address, Andy?
If I put it in the chat, will people get it? I don't know. I'll do it anyway, and then hopefully.
And we can forward it out with the recording as well. But super interesting, Andy. I've learned a lot. That's totally up leveled my knowledge base. And appreciate your time today. And thanks everyone for joining. And we'll
Fantastic.
send out
Thank you very much.
Thank you.